Just like in our last two Star Wars videos, our story begins back during Star Wars Celebration, specifically 2005. We were 2 prequels in, Revenge of the Sith was about to be released to the public, and disappointment was in the air. But even though the general public had, well, mixed reactions to the prequels, fans were still clamoring for more Star Wars. During the hype, George Lucas announced that they were currently writing a live-action TV show all about the dark and gritty street life of the Star Wars universe. No Jedi to come save you in this world, this story was all about going deep into the grimy world. So what happened, and why didn't we get to see this series come to television? Well, let's investigate. The best way to see how good a series most likely would have ended up would be to look at how good the crew is. So who did Lucas hire right after the announcement of the show to help him create Star Wars Underworld? It was announced almost immediately that Rick McCallum, who was basically George Lucas's right-hand man during the making of the prequels, would executive produce the series with Lucas. So right after the ending of the prequels, they would both just begin working on this series together. He wasn't the only hire for the series, of course. Lucas and McCallum would then go after the biggest names in sci-fi television to help develop their story. If they were going to make this, they wanted it to be good. Lucas and McCallum interviewed over 200 writers from all over the world, including England, the United States, Paris, Budapest, and Australia. At the time, Battlestar Galactica and Doctor Who were the 2 biggest sci-fi shows on television, so they jumped on the opportunity to work with these writers behind those shows. From Doctor Who and Battlestar Galactica, they got their writer's staff, which is listed right here. They'd all gather at Skywalker Ranch every couple of months and write scripts for Star Wars Underworld all day with George Lucas, which sounds exactly like Star Wars Detours, which we covered in the last episode. When asked about the process of their sessions, one of their writers, Ronald D. Moore, went on to say this: "We'd be arguing stories, and there was a point where I found myself in an intense argument with George Lucas about what Darth Vader would or would not do, and part of my brain kind of went, what the hell are you doing? Are you really going to argue with George Lucas about what Darth Vader would do? George gets to win all of his arguments." Okay, right off the bat, this sounds like a little fun quote about the humorous nature behind arguing with one of the most famous directors of all time, but if you really think about this quote is a huge red flag for this series. One of the main reasons that the prequels ended up the way that they did was because behind the scenes, nobody said no to George Lucas until it was too late.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
In that quote, Ronald D. Moore basically explains what's going on through those people's minds as they argue with George Lucas about Star Wars. They just assume that Lucas was right because he was the creator after all. But although this is a huge red flag, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we haven't gone over the whole series yet, so let's investigate further before we make our final decision. George Lucas originally wanted to make a 25-episode season with each episode being an hour long, which is a ton. To put that into modern perspective, shows like Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones usually keep the episode count to around 10 or 12, even having a mid-season break sometimes. George and the writing staff had so much fun making the show, they decided to keep going with the process and complete double the amount of episodes they originally planned. Instead of sitting down and writing just a 25-episode season, they wrote 2 seasons worth of content, over 50 episodes. Unfortunately, these scripts had never been shared on the internet in any way, so it's impossible to say exactly what they featured, but we still know a fair amount about what it would have looked like, so let's get into what Star Wars Underworld entailed. Like most Star Wars media, Star Wars Underworld takes place in between Episode 3 and Episode 4. It's rumored that most of the series would have taken place on the planet of Coruscant, where a fair amount of the prequels took place. The story would have revolved around the gritty underbelly of Coruscant and its citizens. To get an idea of what that would have looked like, the bar scene from Episode 2 gives us a good idea of what the setting would have had in store. The story would have revolved around new characters, but familiar faces thrown in every now and then. When asked by the press, George Lucas described Underworld as kind of like Episode 4. It's funny and there's action, but it's a lot more talky. It's more of what I would call a soap opera with a bunch of personal dramas in it. It's not really based on action-adventure films from the 30s, it's actually more based on film noir movies from the 40s. Okay, that sounds pretty cool. It's certainly something different for the fans, and that's always welcome sometimes. You guys may also notice that this sounds a lot like another property that was planned by Lucas. This is eerily similar to Star Wars 1313, a planned video game that was to follow the life of a younger Boba Fett as he worked his way around the gritty world of Star Wars. Just like Underworld, the project was also cancelled. There's no news on whether or not they would have intertwined in any way, but the story of a young Boba Fett trying to figure out his path in the galaxy could have been incredibly cool. Steven Skaya, who was one of the people developing stories with Lucas, revealed a couple things about the series before its cancellation was announced. Here's the clip.
There's no greater thrill than re-breaking inside the canon of Star Wars stories that you've always wanted to tell. We told the story of how Han met Chewie and how Lando lost the Millennium Falcon. I even got to pitch a Boba Fett action scene with his rocket pack.
It makes sense that Lucas wanted to tell the story of a young Han Solo in the TV show. There was even a deleted scene in episode 3 where Han Solo would have been on Kashyyyk with the Wookiees, which is probably an entire video on its own because oh man, it's stupid. But if this show is ever brought back, I can never imagine that portion ever returning just because we have the new Han Solo, Star Wars Solo film, a Star Wars Solo story. Oh my god, I think I'm having a stroke. Also, notice that he mentions that he pitches an idea about Boba Fett. It was never actually confirmed to be part of the story, it was just a pitch, which maybe was leaving room for Star Wars 1313. Before we get into the final days of Underworld's production and how it was cancelled, there's one more storyline that we haven't talked about. Cory Barlog, who was known for working on the God of War franchise, got a chance to read some of the scripts for Underworld, and he ended up telling the public his reaction to one specific storyline that he read. I was allowed to go up to the ranch and read the scripts for the TV show. It was the most mind-blowing thing I'd ever experienced. They made the Emperor a sympathetic figure who was wronged by this fucking heartless woman. She's this hardcore gangster and she just totally destroyed him as a person. I almost cried while reading this. This is the Emperor, the lightning out of the fingers Emperor. That's something magical. So from what we can gather, Star Wars Underworld seemed to have a sort of storyline where they do an origin of the Emperor, where a woman must have wronged him and made him what he is today. I really wish we had these scripts to read, cause man, that doesn't sound too good. I mean, it could have been done well, but I really don't like the idea behind it. Cory Barlog does speak of the storyline as if it's the greatest thing he's ever read though, although that may just be because he was looking to make a deal with Lucas to make a tie-in game. Again, maybe there was some sort of connection between Star Wars 1313 and Underworld. So now that we know everything about the storyline, let's get into how it was cancelled and what happened in the end. There was never a single point where Star Wars Underworld was officially announced to be cancelled. It was never that simple. But why did it never happen when Lucas was in charge? It seemed like he loved the idea of it and he loved the scripts, so why not? Well, I'll let him explain it.
Well, right now we don't know. We have a movie of the week in 50 hours, written, all done, ready to go. It's just that we can't figure out a way of doing it for less than $50 million an episode. And obviously we can't afford to do that. So I'm not going to compromise on the quality of it. So we just have to keep working on the technology to see if we can improve ways of getting the story told without it costing a fortune.
So basically, they just didn't have the budget to make what they actually wrote down. I guess when you want your entire show to look like this, it's bound to be a little expensive. Turns out the writers actually realized that this was going to be a problem while writing the scripts, yet nothing was done. Ronald D. Moore commented on the writing process, quote, "The scripts were written as if money was no object. George was like, don't worry about it. Rick McCallum would groan and put his heads in his hands periodically. For us, it was like, okay, fuck it, let's write whatever we want then." No wonder they were having so much fun writing this show. Obviously this behavior bit them back after they finished, and Lucas realized that they would never be able to make any of this. But let's put that aside and take a look at before they realized these budget problems and what the last days of production looked like. When asked about how it all ended, Matthew Graham, who was one of the writers for Underworld, had this to say. "We just parted company with a shake of a hand, then I was told we were gearing up on production. We'll probably start in Australia. I was told maybe that I might go down to Australia and spend more time there, maybe giving an overview of the scripts, helping with getting them production ready, but of course that day never came." So over time, George Lucas realized that they would never be able to afford it and the production was halted. With how Star Wars Underworld was written, it would have never been able to have been made for TV. The writers and George Lucas were right. The show was ambitious, but maybe just a little too ambitious. But if you're claiming for a live-action Star Wars TV show, then don't worry, it's actually happening pretty soon. Currently, we don't know whether or not it will be like Underworld, but it will probably be the closest thing we'll get to it. So per usual, I've put a poll up in the top right hand corner asking whether or not you guys would have liked to have seen this show. For me, I'd give it a chance, but there's definitely some red flags throughout. If George Lucas is right, and each episode would have needed over $50 million for effects, but he also wanted it to be mostly a dialogue heavy show, then that means they would have been going heavy on the CGI. Like prequel heavy. That's definitely worrying. Especially since it's run by Lucas and McCallum, the two guys behind the prequels. I will say the concept is cool though, and the show would be worth a try on that alone, even if Emperor Palpatine's love story is a little weird. So I said last week that I'd be giving away a copy of Battlefront 2 for a random person who subscribed and then followed me on Twitter, and it turns out people love Battlefront 2, which is good, so I'm here to announce the winner. So congrats to Jonah for winning Battlefront 2. And don't worry, if you didn't win this, I would stay subscribed and such. This giveaway was super successful, so we're definitely going to be doing another one soon, and if you're followed and subscribed, then you're just automatically in. I'd also like to thank our current Patreon donators, Nathan Franks, Roberto Martinez, Samantha Crawford, Jesse White, James Fitzpatrick, and Jose. Big thanks to those guys for helping out the show, and if you want to help out Cutshort too, you can look into Patreon and see if you'd like to help out like these guys did. So again, thank you for watching.